Thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be here. It's an honor to accept this prize on behalf of Professor Heiner Bielefeld, Dr. Michael Wiener, and myself. We co-authored the book together. It's also wonderful to receive the Alberigo Award in the first year that it's being offered, and I give my thanks to yourself, Professor, and also the Foundation for this honor. We all know that Professor Alberigo was, it's in his memory that this prize is being honored, and he was a professor emeritus of church history at the University of Bologna here, and also held the UNESCO chair on religious pluralism and peace. My co-authors couldn't be here because Professor Bielefeld has an appointment, a visiting professorship appointment, and was already committed to being in Norway at this time. And Dr. Michael Wiener was, if I do this, on UN mission. So apologies about that. Professor Heiner Bielefeld is professor of human rights and human rights policy at the University of Erlangen in Germany. And Dr. Michael Wiener is a UN human rights officer at the United Nations. He has a very distinguished history, handling various posts in the United Nations. He's also a scholar, he's published widely, and he has worked, with the UN mandate on freedom of religion or belief. Heiner Bielefeld, of course, was the special rapporteur on freedom of religion or belief, and in fact, at the time of us writing this book together, he held that position. So it was in between his missions to different countries, his UN appointments, his university engagements, that we met several times and wrote this book together. I first met Dr. Michael Wiener in 2006. There was an occasion in Prague, in the Czech Republic, marking the 25th anniversary of the adoption of the 1981 UN Declaration on the elimination of all forms of intolerance and discrimination based on religion or belief. At that time, he was the human rights officer working with a fairly newly appointed rapporteur, Asma Jahangir, and I will be coming to her name a little bit later. Or actually, now that I've mentioned her, let me talk about her. Asma Jahangir passed away, unfortunately, in a very untimely manner early and almost exactly 1 year ago. I'm sure you know her as a courageous and brave lawyer in Pakistan. She also was very active at the international level. She held no less than 3 mandates of the United Nations over time. She was the UN Special Rapporteur on extrajudicial killings. She was the UN Special Rapporteur on freedom of religion or belief, and also at the time of her passing was the UN Special Rapporteur on the human rights situation in the Islamic Republic of Iran. She championed the rights of children. She worked against the death penalty. She championed the rights of minorities, women's rights. Nobody inside Pakistan knew the extent of her international involvement and activities, and nobody outside Pakistan knew the extent of her work within Pakistan. It was really on her passing, and when there were hundreds of tweets and messages and coverage that made you just realize how extensive her contributions to the human rights field, to the legal field, and just to championing the downtrodden was. Michael instigated this book project, and I'm sorry for the shameless marketing of Oxford University Press, but you get a discount, so that's how I justified it to myself. But Michael instigated this project and got us together about 5 years ago now to start on this book project. And the collaboration with Heiner and Michael was absolutely wonderful. They let me be alone here, so I think I'll forgive them for that, because the collaboration so far was so great. The book is part of the Oxford Commentaries in International Law series of Oxford University Press. Now, the other monographs in that series address an area of law where there is a human rights treaty. So, for example, they address the African Charter on Human and People's Rights, they address the Refugee Convention, or they address the European Convention on Human Rights. So our appeal to OUP had to be, please can we are proposing a book project on freedom of religion or belief. There is no treaty on freedom of religion or belief, but we still want you to have it in the commentary series. Now, what kind of justification could persuade a publisher to kind of divert from that? I mean, it does say commentary, and it's a legal series, so, it makes sense for them to restrict it to treaties. But what we said is that, well, there has been a 30-year mandate practice in the area of freedom of religion or belief. Yes, we know that mandate practice is not binding law, but let's go back and look at the history and why the fact that there was a 30-year mandate practice had anything to do with a legal treaty. Well, it was back in 1960 that the UN General Assembly instructs that there should be a drafting process should begin for a treaty on racial and religious discrimination. So they dutifully start their work, and after 2 years they realize that the area of religious intolerance is proving very tricky. So they decide to switch their attention to racial discrimination. Within 3 years, they have the draft of the UN Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of Racial Discrimination, and it becomes the first human rights monitoring body, treaty body, and the first UN human rights treaty in that body of 10 that we now have that comes into force. So racial discrimination, early 60s, no problem, it proceeds. So then, after that has completed, they decide to turn their attention back to religious intolerance and discrimination. How long do you think it takes before they come up with a declaration, a non-binding instrument on religious intolerance? 21 years after that 1960 decision of the UN General Assembly, we have this 8-article, an 8-article UN declaration on religious intolerance and discrimination. And that has remained as a declaration, not as a treaty. But I think that's a very, just a litmus test, a very perceptible indication of how tricky the international community has found dealing with not religion in all its diversity and, fully, merely the question of religious intolerance and discrimination. Took 21 years, and it's an 8-article, pretty compact declaration. However, when in 1986, the UN Human Rights Commission decided that they adopted and decided that there should be a UN mandate, a special rapporteur on freedom of religion or belief, they said that the mandate holder was tasked with the implementation of this UN declaration. So, in a roundabout way, the mandate practice and the operationalization of religious intolerance and discrimination for over 30 years through a mandate holder such as Asma Jahangir, Heiner Bielefeld, and currently Dr. Ahmad Shahid of the University of Essex, originally from the Maldives. These mandate holders can visit countries, can explore the landscape of freedom of religion or belief. They report to the UN General Assembly and the Human Rights Council. In fact, Dr. Shahid reported to the Human Rights Council yesterday in Geneva. And they also accept communications or complaints about violations to freedom of religion or belief. So it's not only in the mandate practice, it's not only that history of how laborious it was to come to a UN declaration on intolerance and discrimination on the grounds of religion or belief, but also we find, of course, other indications and other protections of religion or belief in other instruments, like the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, like the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, perhaps the broadest capture of freedom of religion or belief, which includes change of religion or belief in clear language, and other instruments. So areas which are included in this book include, for example, freedom of religion or belief and the rights of prisoners. Something that is probably of a lot of contemporary interest and needs a lot more exploration is the question of migrants and freedom of religion or belief. I have to say that the photos coming out of Abu Dhabi of the Pope speaking to thousands of migrant workers in Abu Dhabi, I found very moving, not because it should surprise us, it shouldn't, but in a country that has almost 90% of the workforce in the United Arab Emirates are migrants. They aren't given permanent status and have a very fragile status, that in their remoteness from family and homeland and in difficult, many of them in very difficult work circumstances, we really should be caring about the provision of religion or belief services to them in that heightened and delicate situation. So finally, those photos were perhaps a recognition of so much more that needs to be done in that arena. Child rights, women's rights, race, torture, these are other sub-chapters of the proposed book that OUP, as you know, accepted. I actually stumbled across the richness of freedom of religion or belief quite by chance when I started my doctoral research. I wanted to study the impact of UN action on the situation of the Baha'is in Iran back in the mid-90s. And of course, then when you start digging into the UN documents, freedom of religion or belief is core to that, as is minority rights, as is the intransigence of a state that has a state-instigated, state-driven, and state-perpetuated project for the elimination of the Baha'is in its country. So, however many UN fora and however many international interventions there are, and sadly the persecution of the Baha'is has not got any better since my studies in the late 90s and up to 2000, but however much the intervention, if a state has it as part of its state-building project to persecute, it is very difficult for international actors to persuade. There has to be a change of political climate and volition by the state authorities to let go of that decision and grip. However, of course, if there isn't international attention, and when there are so many evidences of the determination of the Iranian government to eliminate, they have put in a confidential document that was released by a UN special rapporteur a couple of decades ago, they want to eliminate the roots of the country, the roots of the Baha'is within and outside of the country. So, a complete elimination of the Baha'i community would not have been at all surprising with that kind of determination and centralization. So the international attention and the UN action has certainly prevented a genocide. Now, freedom of religion or belief was key to that study, and we see it increasingly playing a role in different arenas. But back in the 90s, I just want to give you a small snapshot in just a few more minutes of how the field has changed since the mid-90s until now. At that time, there was a twin-volume collection by John Witte and Johan van der Vyver that came out of Emory University. If you look at it with today's lens, you would say that most of those chapters are not entirely freedom of religion or belief. They're definitely relevant, but many of the scholars that contributed to those twin volumes would have identified themselves as area studies or constitutional lawyers, or they would have had some other hats. But, it was our Forb field at the time. Also, there was an Oslo conference on freedom of religion or belief held in 1998, of which the Oslo coalition that is still active, the coalition was born out of that conference. From that came a book by Cole Durham, Torrey Lindholm, and Bahia Tahzibli that is called Facilitating Freedom of Religion or Belief, a desk book. That took a while coming out, so that was in 2004. Abdullahi An-Naim had started his work in the 90s, and I think he's pretty much spawned a field of Islamic thinking on human rights matters. And then it was Kevin Boyle and Juliet Sheen that brought out Freedom of Religion or Belief, a World Report in 1997. Theo van Boven, who had worked in the UN and was also a professor of law at Maastricht, also had written on this. But really, it was these publications and these books that we would primarily identify with that field. So, wow, things have changed in the past 20 years. Now it is impossible to imagine that you can write your PhD on the UN, religion, and freedom of religion or belief. That would be an impossible doctoral project, but it was eminently feasible at that time because so little had been written about it. Now it can't even be, child rights and freedom of religion or belief. You have to sort of target one particular aspect of it. But of course, the popularity of religion and freedom of religion or belief has come with a price and on the back of many violations. I remember a colleague stopping me when I was teaching in London some years ago, saying, "Oh, you know, 9/11 has brought so much attention to your scholarship, you must be really happy." And I think he meant well, but it was a little bit of a strange comment to make. It would be far better to have unpopular scholarship and not have tragedies like that, for sure. But I don't think freedom of religion or belief has had its day over the past 25 years. I'm not suggesting it's the panacea to all of the world's ills, but I think it still has a lot of momentum in it. It's still playing a role in discussions about freedom of expression and freedom of religion or belief, where to draw the line. It's still the question of state religion and the treatment of others still has a lot of, certainly a lot to deliver in terms of practice as well as scholarship. Aspects of women's rights and freedom of religion or belief, I think. And freedom of religion or belief has an interesting balance to it. So, on the one hand, it doesn't prohibit state religion. On the other hand, it puts a heavy burden on the state that has a state religion or ideology. It reminds us that it's not a protection for only the established majority recognized religions, but for all. It reminds us that if there are limitations on the grounds of morality, General Comment 22 says that it cannot be on the basis of one tradition that you impose that limitation on the manifestation of freedom of religion or belief. It needs to be more generally recognized. And in fact, that was the inspiration for the General Comments on freedom of expression, which adopted that same term. And we also see new initiatives, one of them being the Beirut Declaration and its 18 commitments, which is an initiative of the UN Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights, where they are suggesting that the connections and the conversations between religion and human rights are multiple, and they both play a role in fostering the development of peaceful societies, and there should be more reflection on the interrelationship between religion and human rights. I recommend you look it up. It's something I wrote a chapter on about 20 years ago, and I couldn't have imagined that the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights would now be spearheading such a project. So things have moved on. The book has 35 sections. We address some of these in shorter chapters, some in longer chapters, but let me just briefly end with what a joy it was to work with Michael and Heiner in writing it. Now, the proper thing to do, or the efficient thing to do when writing a book with 35 sections, is to divide it into 3. You each draft those 12 chapters, and then you just stick them together and you send it into OUP and you're done. But oh no, that's not what we did. Yes, we took a third of that for the initial draft, but my goodness, the other 2 would jump in on it and then comment on every single word and phrase, and why did you do that, and you forgot this, and so it was such a wonderful learning experience that at the end of it, I thought that even if there wasn't a book at the end of it, I've learned so much, it would have been just personally so enriching and worthwhile. So we met several times on the fringes of different events in Oxford and Geneva to get this done. Now, It's not often that one's academic work gets recognized. It's not often that it gets a prize, and certainly I've never been given a financial prize for the work I've done. So this is really unique and an absolute undeserved joy and pleasure. And we thank you, Professor Maloney, for having presented us with the plaque yesterday. €20,000 is a high sum, and in the field of freedom of religion or belief, it should go to a worthy cause. We've decided that 1/3 of it should rightly go to the Asma Jahangir Foundation. Her law firm was the first law firm in Pakistan ever that was founded only by women, and it continues its good work. And so I'm sure that will go to a very good use. 1/3 of the money, Heiner and Michael have been busy since this book. They've produced another book on philosophical perspectives on freedom of religion or belief, which will be coming out shortly from Pennsylvania University Press. They're both German. It needs to be translated into German. And if you allow us, 1/3 of the money will go towards allowing the translation and the royalties, etc., for that to be published in Germany as well. And when it came towards the end of the project, we roped in a DPhil student of mine. We said, look, we just want you to look at the footnotes, just harmonize it. It won't be too much work. And Tiago, who is there in the back row, and who alerted us to the prize, because he was here last year, Tiago Alves Pinto, who will be defending his PhD shortly as well, found that actually there was a lot more work than just reading the footnotes. And he actually proofed the whole book and corrected all the footnotes and picked up some other corrections. And we would be honored if he would accept the other 1/3 towards the completion of his doctoral studies. So thank you.